Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to be doing my May wrap-up. So talking about all the books that I read in the month of May and giving my thoughts and my recommendations if I feel like you should check them out. I'm going to separate this into genres. So I read mostly fantasy this month, so I'll tackle the fantasy books first. And then I read a couple of works of nonfiction, which I thought were really good. So I'm going to put those second, but I do recommend that you stick around because I thought that they were really insightful. And the last that I read is totally outside what I usually talk about, and it was a romance novel and the conclusion to a trilogy. So unless you're really into romance, you might not want to watch through that one. Unless you really like listening to me talk, I don't know. But I will jump into those books so that this doesn't end up being excessively long. The very first fantasy novel that I read this month was Fireborne by Rosaria Munda. So this is a book that I've heard a lot about, and probably if you're on Fantasy BookTube, you also have probably heard a lot about because Elliot Brooks has really loved it. So she sang its praises either earlier this year or perhaps last year and really loved it. And then Alan over at the Library of Allenxandria picked it up and also really loved it. And it was actually Alan's really enthusiastic and informative review that made me want to pick it up and made me decide that I was going to read it this month. Actually, I think this was kind of my month of reading books Alan loves. So I've read a lot of Alan books this month that I'm going to talk about, but he has definitely inspired a fair chunk of this wrap up for May. But the essential story behind Fireborne, it is a YA political fantasy, and it follows two characters in a post-revolutionary world. So in their world, they were both orphaned by this revolution and came from very different socioeconomic statuses. So we have one character, Lee, who was actually a member of the ruling family and has been living kind of in secret, raised in an orphanage. And then we have Annie, who was a member of the peasantry. She was actually a serf, and her family had been killed, I think, before the revolution, kind of leading up to that time. And they become friends at the orphanage in which they live, and they both grow up aspiring to be a dragon rider. So prior to this revolution, only members of the elite caste, so only the ruling members of society, could be dragon riders. It was thought that only members of the elite society could even tame a dragon, could have a dragon pick them, so it was very much this us versus them mentality. And one of the tenets, one of the pillars of the new society's rule is that they feel like these opportunities should be available for everyone. So at the time of childhood, I don't remember what age it is, but you undergo a test, and this test is supposed to rank you to tell you what layer or what echelon of society you belong in. And so if you are tested as, I don't remember what the color is, I don't know if it's like a gold, but they wear different armbands. And if you test highest, then you get to enter into this kind of ruling class and have the opportunity to ride your own dragon. And otherwise you might be a tradesperson, you may be a laborer, a serving person. Whatever the test shows is what you do. And the friendship between these two characters is probably what provides the backbone to this story. But the author, Rosaria Munda, has a history in political science, and it really shows. If you like political fantasy, even if you're not a typical reader of YA, I think that you probably would still like this book. I enjoyed it. Political intrigue and political fantasy is not always my favorite thing. I like adventure fantasy, I like sword and sorcery fantasy, I like heroic fantasy, and I really like strong character development. And while I think that these were good characters, I think a lot of what the book is focused on is more of the thematic resonance, the questions, the big questions that come out of these events, these revolutions. Like, what were people fighting against? Does revolution change the way that people in all levels of society are treated? Or do you just trade one evil for another? There's a lot of really important questions, and from people who are a lot more knowledgeable about these things than I am, this seems to be a fairly accurate depiction of what happens in those situations. So it was really fascinating to read. I liked it enough to continue along with the series. It did not become a favorite of mine. I don't love it with every fiber of my being, but I did really enjoy it. One disappointing aspect for me, and probably what brought my enjoyment down a little bit, is I actually thought that the dragon fighting was a little bit boring. I did not think that combat was Rosarimunda's strong suit, and I found it really difficult to conceptualize that someone who writes so well about other things could make dragon combat seem a little bit boring. So I was a little bit disappointed by that, but would still highly recommend this novel, especially if you are a fan of political fantasy. The second fantasy novel that I read this month is one that I did a full review for, so if you have not checked that out, then please go do so, and that is The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding. This is a work of classic fantasy inspired by that typical quest-based fantasy like The Lord of the Rings, but with a bit of a modern spin on there. It initially follows as a giant book, I think it's like 800 or 900 pages, but it follows two friends, Aaron and Cade, and they grow up in an occupied society. So they have grown up under the rules of the Crodans, who have come into their country of Ossia and taken over. So there is still a generation of people like Aaron's and Cade's parents who grew up in a free Ossia, but they are the children of this occupied society. And much like the previous book I talked about, they grow up in very different castes. So Aaron was part of the ruling society of Ossia, and he still has some of the benefits and privileges that come along with that. Even though he is most definitely still looked upon as lesser by the ruling Crodans, he does enjoy a position of power over the other Ossians. And then we have Cade, his best friend, who is a member of what essentially is the peasantry. His parents are working class, and he kind of looks up to Aaron and trails along after Aaron, kind of like a puppy. But their friendship, again, is the backbone of this novel, and we see as a tragic event occurs in Aaron's life, both Cade and Aaron are put into a prison work camp, and their relationship starts to change, their thoughts about their kingdom starts to change, and what we get from there is kind of a found family adventure style story that really explores what it means to live in an occupied country, what it means to fight for what you believe in, how your values and what you appreciate change as you get older. So it's a really nice coming of age story in that way. It is still very much adult fantasy, but it is adult fantasy that incorporates that coming of age element. There's a good mishmash of genres here as well. There's definitely some horror elements that come out of here, and I really fell in love with the characters in this one. It is the first novel in a series. The second book is not out and there is no release date, but I think it works very well as a standalone. So if you watch my review or if you've heard of it and you're wondering whether or not you should read it, I really enjoyed it. It was one of my favorite reads of the month, and I really loved it. I would highly encourage that you go out and pick it up. The third fantasy book that I read was me filling in the very few Neil Gaiman books that I have left that I have not read. And that was one of his children's books called Odd and the Frost Giants. I read this one on Kindle because I have been putting together a guide to Neil Gaiman video to put out, and I wanted to make sure that some of the leftover books that I hadn't read, I could kind of whip through them. And this is a middle grade book, and it follows the character of Odd, who is a young Viking boy whose dad has passed away and whose mom has remarried, and his family seems to have no place for him. Odd was involved in an accident in his younger years that I think it was a rock that fell on his foot, but it has left him with kind of a mangled and very painful injury in his foot, and so he walks with a limp. He needs to walk with a cane, and is kind of looked down upon by the other members of this warrior society. And so Odd decides that he's going to leave home. He's going to go up to his dad's old woodworking cabin in the woods, and when he's there, he discovers some animals who may be more than they appear. And so what happens is you get this really charming story about Odd, who gets embroiled in the misadventures of some of the very well-known Norse-inspired gods, and it's just a really delightful little story. It probably took, I don't know, 45 minutes to an hour for me to read the whole thing, but it was so delightful that I ordered a copy to arrive here for me to read with my kids. if you're looking for an epic fantasy novel, definitely not what this is, but if you're looking for something cute, a nice charming middle grade story, or something to read with the children in your life, then I would highly recommend this one. The next book, and also the last book that I read for the month, were 2 books on my Dark Tower reread. So I read The Gunslinger, which I also did a video, kind of like a video quasi why I think you should read The Gunslinger. And then I also read the second book, The Drawing of the Three. I've talked about the Dark Tower at great length in the last couple of videos on my channel, so I won't belabor those points any further, but I will say that I'm just making my way through the first few Dark Tower novels right now because I'm participating in a discussion about them a little bit later in the month, so I'm really looking forward to that. And if you want to hear more of my thoughts about the Dark Tower, then I will give you more details as that approaches. But I'm also just really happy to be doing this reread. I love the Dark Tower series, and it is such a rereadable series. If you have read it and enjoyed it, I don't think there's anybody who would say that this is not a good series for rereading. There's so many details, so much richness that is hidden in there, and that you will definitely not discover on your first read through. So I'm having a blast rereading these books. Really looking forward to getting through the first 3 because I remember Wizard and Glass being my favorite when I read it for the first time, and I'm really looking forward to reading that one again. The next fantasy book that I read this month is really exciting because it is the beginning of a series that I have been wanting to read for so long, and that was Mort by Terry Pratchett. So this is my very first Discworld novel, and I am so excited to finally have started the Discworld series. Discworld is a fantasy series that I avoided for a really long time because I was really nervous about it. I was intimidated by the scope of the series, and I really didn't have a good understanding of what Discworld was. In my mind for a long time, I thought that this was a series of books that I had to read from beginning to end, that I was going to have to start and have like these 30-something books to go through. I knew they all had different names and with different characters, and I didn't really know how I was supposed to organize any of them. And then Alan at the Library of Allenxandria did an amazing video about the Discworld series, and it is his favorite series, and that passion and love for it really shines through in that video. Based on what he had said, I thought that I would like the Death books the most, and so I picked up the first one this month, and I really liked it. I didn't love it, so I was like the very teensiest bit disappointed because I really thought it was going to be like a 5-star instant favorite for me, and it was not that, but I did really enjoy it. There were a couple of parts that made me laugh out loud, and one quote about the form of government, which I'm not going to spoil because if you read it, then it's a really, really funny line from the book, but that was one of the lines that made me laugh out loud, and I wrote it in my reading journal because I enjoyed it so much. But I didn't find myself super compelled to like keep reading. I wasn't like, oh gosh, I need to figure out what happened. It was more like a really enjoyable book that I picked up and was like, this is so fun. I really love Terry Pratchett's style. And I really love his voice. I think that his writing is so distinctive, and I'm looking forward to reading more of it. It's just that I didn't get that rush of like, this is my favorite ever from reading Mort, but would highly, highly recommend. And if you've been thinking about reading Discworld, I would highly recommend checking out Alan's video. I will link it below so that you can go and watch it and decide for yourself where a good place to start in Discworld may be. The second to last fantasy book that I read in the month of May is a continuation of a series, so I won't talk too much about it here, but it's a, It is a King Arthur retelling by Kirsten White. So she is a YA author, and this is a YA King Arthur retelling that centers around the character of Guinevere. So the second book is called The Camelot Betrayal, but the first book is called, what is it called? So the first book is called The Guinevere Deception. Now my hair is everywhere. I apologize. This is not super professional behavior in this video. The Guinevere Deception, and it is called that because in this book, the main character of Guinevere is actually a changeling in disguise. So she has been raised by Merlin, who is very much a background character in this series, and she is sent to King Arthur's court disguised as the Princess Guinevere so that she can protect King Arthur from plots that Merlin believes are unfolding around him. It is It loosely follows the Arthurian legend. Obviously, all of the main players show up, but there are various changes in gender identity, in the types of relationships that are formed, and it is a really interesting take on King Arthur. Again, this was a series that I was really hoping to love because Kiersten White wrote one of my favorite YA series, which is, I think it's called The Conqueror's Saga, but the first book is called And I Darken, and it is a gender-bent story of Vlad the Impaler. So the main character's name is Lada, and she is a young woman who is fashioned after Vlad the Impaler, and it is really dark and really good, and I loved the characters so much. And because I love Arthurian legend, I really thought that I would love this one too. But I have just ended up liking it. The main reason that I keep reading is I really enjoy the character of Mordred that Kiersten White has created, and I think that the final book in the series is going to have a lot more of him in it. So I am looking forward to that part, but overall I am not loving the series as much as I had hoped. But I do hope to also put together a reader's guide to Arthurian legend pretty soon, so I will talk about the various books that I have read of that type and give some of my very favorites as recommendations. But that leads us to the final fantasy book that I read this month, and it was so much fun. It was Sébastien de Castel's Greatcoats, the very first book called Traitor's Blade. And I loved it. I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads because I did find that there was a little bit of clunkiness just in the introduction. There was a little bit of info dumping. I felt like it took Sébastien de Castel a little bit of time to find his voice, but once he did, it was so good. The Greatcoat series is inspired by the Three Musketeers. It is about a group of warriors who work alongside the king, and they, I guess, deliver the king's justice or the justice for the kingdom. They do not serve the king, they serve the good of the people, and they go out into the various duchies in the kingdom because all of the various pieces of the land are ruled by their own dukes and duchesses, who for all intents and purposes seem very corrupt and very attached to the amount of power that they have. And they are supposed to go out and fight for justice and bring down judgments on people where they believe that wrongs have been done. And as this book opens up, it is 5 years since the murder of the king by an uprising of these dukes and duchesses, and the Greatcoats have been disbanded. So we follow a group of 3 friends, Falcio, Caste, and Brasti, who are still working together, trying to hold on to their honor and fulfill the dying wishes of their king. So he has bequeathed many of his greatcoats with a quest to follow through with after his departure. And we follow them as they're trying to carve out a place for themselves in the world. They are reviled. They were not liked by the dukes and duchesses when the king was alive, but they are hated, looked down upon, and felt to have no honor in this kind of post-king world. And it's really interesting because there's a big contrast between this like swashbuckling adventure fantasy, and there is a lot of what you would expect from that, a lot of witty banter, a lot of silly scenes, a lot of really cool sword fights, but then you get these very grim, dark moments where horrible things happen. There's torture, there's murder, there's death, there's sadness abound, and it makes for a very interesting contrast, but to me it never felt jarring. It felt like it all worked together very seamlessly, and the friendships in this book are phenomenal. The friendships between the 3 main characters, you can see that they care for one another. You can see in the way that they interact, the way they speak to one another, that they're very close. But it was the friendship between Falcio and the late King Palus that you get through flashbacks that was the part of this book that really roped me in. Their relationship was so heartbreaking because you get so much of the depth of that and you can see how much they cared about each other. But as the book opens up, you already know that the king has been killed, and so it is heartbreaking to watch. But this was, I think, my favorite book. I really liked the Ember Blade as well. I believe that as I continue with the Greatcoats, I am just going to like them more and more. But for the 2 books, if you're going to read anything that I read this month, the Ember Blade and the Greatcoats. If you have not read those, I enjoyed them so much. Could not recommend them highly enough. Now, I just want to touch briefly on the couple of works of nonfiction that I read this month. So the first one was Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. This is a book that I've had on hold at my library. So I get all of my audiobooks through the library, and I've had it on hold for probably almost a year. I don't know. Since it was released, I've probably been on the list, and it has taken this long for it to get to me. So this is a very well-known work of nonfiction, and it explores the idea of caste and the caste system that exists specifically in the United States, although there's a lot of comparison to the caste system in India, and it kind of compares the two systems and the ways that people exist within those systems. So I read this book for a variety of reasons. Obviously, it was getting a lot of buzz. A lot of people had talked about how important it was, how moving it was, how informative it was, and it definitely was all of those things. I personally like to be very informed on a lot of the social issues that are happening. My job, I interact with a lot of really vulnerable people on a day-to-day basis, and I feel like in terms of my professional development, it's really important for me to understand the issues that impact people on a daily basis. From a personal perspective, I like to grow and learn and understand as a person. I like to read about and learn about things that fall within my own realm of experiences, but also outside my own realm of experiences. And I like to think that in small ways, I can make a difference in my life, the lives of my children, and I can try to kind of guide us all in a path where we become more self-aware people who are able to make a positive difference in the world. I mean for this to get super philosophical, but I'm not a religious person. So really the only kind of guiding principle that I have to move my life forward is the belief that I can make some sort of impact, or I can improve the world that we live in some small way. So I think that for me, fiction has been a big part of learning how to do that and opening up the ability for me to do that. And so I found this book very helpful in that way. I also, have to come to the realization and understanding that that's not why this book was created. It's not up to anybody else to hold my hand or to bring me to a place of understanding, but I do really appreciate that books like this exist. I think that Isabel Wilkerson is a phenomenal writer. I really enjoyed her use of metaphor. I enjoyed the stylistics of this book, the way that it was written, the way that she formatted her story. She, I'm sure, is an excellent journalist. I unfortunately don't get to read as much active journalism as I would like to. I read a fair bit of nonfiction, but I don't read any newspapers. So that is an area of my life in which I am lacking, but I really enjoyed her style. I would definitely pick up other books by her, and I believe she has won a Pulitzer Prize, so this is probably not very surprising news, but highly, highly recommend. In terms of people who are on BookTube as a way to enjoy fiction, I think that reading books like this also broaden my experience in reading fiction. Reading books that show us or reflect back to us some of the struggles of our own society helps me appreciate when authors can really pull off that intricate world building. And if you are a writer, I think that reading in the social sciences and reading some of these more sociological or anthropological novels or works of nonfiction, I think that can be really helpful in devising your own stories and making sure that they feel realistic and making sure that they feel true to the type of world that we live in. So obviously nonfiction can accomplish a variety of tasks, just like fiction can mean a whole lot of different things to different people. But I really, really enjoyed this book. I listened to it via audio, and the narrator is actually someone who I've heard narrate a couple of the books that I've listened to, and I really enjoy her narration as well. So I would highly recommend this one, and as an audiobook, I thought it was fantastic. Total departure from that for the second audiobook of the month, and that was the book, I think it's called Big Answers, Brief Answers to the Big Questions. I have a list written down over there. So Brief Answers to the Big Questions by Stephen Hawking. So as I understand from the introduction here, this is a collection of essays or ideas that was compiled by Hawking's family, his friends, after his passing. And the book is very short. I listened to it via audio, and it was like a 4-hour audio book, I think. So it was very short, and I think there are 4 fundamental questions that are asked in the book. So these are questions like, what is the origin of the universe? Does God exist? And does the idea of the universe beginning negate the idea of God? And so I think that he gives really thoughtful answers. I think that despite his own personal beliefs in religion or the way that he thinks about the universe, I think that he tries very hard to be understanding of everyone's point of view. I felt like there was very little or no condescension in terms of this. This was just him relaying his ideas about the universe, and I thought it was really interesting. I do not have a great mind for theoretical physics or theoretical mathematics. I have much less of a mathematical brain than a literary language-based brain. I did well with math and science because I have a very good memory, and so I memorized a lot of things when I was doing calculus and other courses like that. But once you get away from that practical or applied section of mathematics and you get into the theoretical side, my understanding starts to break down. And my husband is very much the opposite. He's got a great mind for theoretical physics, for these types of things, and it's one of his main areas of interest. And so I like to listen or read books like this because it gives me something to talk about with him, and because I would like to understand more. And I kind of think that the more that I hammer these books in, or the more that I listen, hopefully these concepts will start to open up and to understand. I won't lie, a lot of discussing these huge questions that can bring on some of that existential anxiety or some of that feeling of dread. But I like it. I feel like it's a healthy type of anxiety. It definitely gives me a lot to think about. While it's a very quick read, it does open up a lot of big questions, a lot of room for discussion, but I really, really enjoyed it. If you like or would like to know more about theoretical physics, this is a super accessible book. The narration style, the way that it's written, really does try to break it down for people who don't have that background, and so it's a good starting off point. I've talked about Neil deGrasse Tyson's book, Astrophysics for People in a Hurry, and I would compare this one to that. It's more of like a beginner's guide to theoretical physics, which I really appreciated. The very last book that I read for the month of May was the book Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert. So this is the third and final novel in her Brown Sisters romance trilogy. They're all companion novels, as it is so often with romance, but these are very popular adult contemporary romance. And I liked but didn't love the first two. I think Talia Hibbert's a really talented author. I think her characters are always really well done. Her dialogue is very catchy, and there's none of the clunkiness or awkwardness that I sometimes see in adult romance. It's just that the first two books were very sweet, and I don't like that in a romance. I want there to be some angst. I want there to be some pain. And I really like this story because it started off more as an enemies to lovers relationship. And there was a lot of, I guess, just like personal angst in this book. The two characters are very separate from their friends and families. They both have personalities and character traits and ways of thinking that separate them from those around them. And it is a really lovely book because it's about two people who have struggled to interact with others, who have struggled to find a place of understanding in the world. It's about them coming together and learning not only to appreciate each other, but to appreciate themselves. And so I really, really liked that, but it did have that edge of tension that kind of bumped it up above the other two Brown Sisters books for me. So I had actually thought that I was going to give away the two books that I had in this series, but because I loved Eve Brown so much, I'm just gonna buy that one and then I'm gonna keep all three of them. So this book really did solidify the series for me. I really enjoyed it. It was far and away my favorite of the three. And if you do read some adult romance every now and then please let me know if you have read it, and if you did, if you enjoyed it. However, that is the end of my May wrap up. I hope that you enjoyed it. I would encourage you to pick up any of the books that I've talked about. This was really a good month for reading. There was nothing that I didn't like. There was nothing that on my Goodreads I rated below a 3 stars or maybe even a 3.5 stars. And it was just overall a really satisfying reading month. I hope that this was helpful or informative in some way. I feel like it was a little bit rambly now that we're at the end, but I will see you with another video soon. Bye.